Hi, how's it going? I want to get something out of the way before we get started. Whether or not any particular product is a good value is going to come down to a lot of things, ultimately determined by each individual, what they value, and what their budget is. But it is possible for a product to be far cheaper than the alternative options and still a poor value. A turd on a stick isn't a good value just because it's cheaper than a lollipop. Don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying this camera is a turd on a stick. We'll talk about the camera in a moment. But sometimes folks will take me criticizing a product or calling it a poor value as me saying there are far better alternatives at the same price. Sometimes that's true, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you have to spend more to get something better. And maybe that leads you to decide that a particular product is a good value for you. Like almost everything these days, the cost of cameras continues to skyrocket. I understand that cameras I would call generic, like this Ordro, and so many others, are not only the cheapest option, but they are also just about the only option for consumer camcorders these days. And that's the main reason I keep testing them. Since they are filling the entire market segment right now, I'm hoping some of them are actually good. If I think something is a poor product and a poor value, you can still decide that it's right for you. I only want to help people understand what they are getting so that they don't spend their money and end up disappointed. And if I test a product that lies in the marketing, misrepresents specs and features, has problems and poor performance, I'm probably going to conclude that it's a poor product and a poor value, even if it's cheap. Even if you disagree, hopefully you still find the information helpful for making up your own mind if it's a good value for you. With all of that out of the way, I have here the Ordro XV80 camcorder. This is one of Ordro's newer models, which, at least from initial impressions, seems to be more of the same. In fact, I suspect it's mostly the same as the G730 Sony ripoff I reviewed recently. And right off the bat, it's off to a bad start with the claims. The camera proudly claims to have a Sony IMX415 sensor. If true, it's only a 4K max resolution sensor. And they claim it's an 8-megapixel sensor, which is roughly 4K. Yet they advertise 5K video resolution and 48-megapixel photos. Both of those claims are just objectively not possible with the sensor they claim to use, with the resolution they agree it has. I suspect, like so many of these camcorders, it's arbitrarily upping the resolution of the final output without actually adding any detail. In my experience with these cameras, it makes the files larger for zero benefit. It has the standard camcorder form factor, and it's a bit more ergonomic in the hand than some of their previous models. And it actually includes an external battery charger, which is a nice touch. It's about as cheap as possible and only has 2 terminals, so it's not going to have any high battery temp protection or anything like that, but it works. This camera has an IR mode, but it has no built-in IR light. And actually that brings me to what I found to be the funniest part of the ads for this product. In the image bragging about IR, they got their usual stock photo and put 2 copies of it in the ad, but they forgot to use photo editing software to make the 2 images actually look different. They left them the same and just labeled one with IR and one without IR. Amazing. Oh look, they used the same picture in a different ad, but they remembered to edit it. Nice. It has an audio input jack, it takes an SD card, it has a mini HDMI output, and it supports use as a webcam over the USB port. It also has a little display where a viewfinder would normally be. That's the first time I've seen that. With these cameras, they often copy the body of another company's camera. In this case, it just seems that the one they copied had an electronic viewfinder, and instead of a viewfinder or just a blank piece of plastic, they instead stuck a little display there. It doesn't seem super helpful in what it shows, but it doesn't hurt anything either, so whatever. In another funny ad picture, the graphic they meant to have pasted over the display on the back was left floating in a random spot over the camera. When we talk about performance, I want to start by talking about the false claims, otherwise known as lies. First, zoom. What does 5x or 10x zoom actually represent on a camera lens? It doesn't necessarily indicate how close or how much telephoto you have. at least not directly. It indicates the ratio between the widest the lens can get and the tightest it can get. So if the camera has, say, a 20mm equivalent field of view at the widest end and 5 times zoom, that means it can zoom to a 100mm equivalent field of view. 5x zoom, 5 times 20mm. But if the widest the lens can go is a 50mm equivalent and it still has 5x zoom, it should be a 250mm lens on the widest end. That's still a 5 times difference between the widest and the tightest. With that in mind, this Ordro claims 12x optical zoom. So from the widest angle possible, it should be able to get 12 times tighter. Here is the widest field of view from the Ordro compared to the widest field of view on another camera that has 12x optical zoom. The other camera is clearly wider at the wide end. So if they both have 12 times zoom, the other camera should also be slightly wider when both are zoomed all the way in. But when I zoom both of them all the way in to their max optical zoom, the other camera clearly goes tighter. And I found this to be the case on all Ordro optical zoom cameras when compared with multiple other cameras. This Ordro does not have the amount of optical zoom that it claims. It is both tighter on the widest end and wider on the most telephoto end than multiple other 12x optical zoom cameras I've tested. So on the Ordro, this is as wide of an angle as the lens goes, and it supposedly has 12x optical zoom. So now I will zoom in as far as it goes. And this is the one and only zoom speed. This is as fast as you can zoom in or out. And that is maximum zoom. So here's another camera with 12x optical zoom. It has a much wider angle of view when zoomed all the way out. And so if both of these cameras truly do have 12x optical zoom, this one should not be as tight when zoomed all the way in. So let's zoom all the way in and see how far it goes. This one you can zoom much faster. And yet, when zoomed all the way in with this camera, it actually gets tighter than the other one. So it's wider on the wide end and tighter on the tight end. So 12x optical zoom is a lie. Like many Ordros, this camera claims to have image stabilization. And it has it in the settings, but it does nothing. And if you wanted to do a vlogging scenario, I have image stabilization turned on, and I have face tracking turned on, although it isn't drawing a box around my face, and obviously you can see the image stabilization doesn't really do anything. But it has face tracking turned on, 5K resolution supposedly, 30 frames per second. I'm walking very carefully, and this is as wide as the shot can be. I'm holding my arm completely stretched as far out as it can go, and my head barely even fits in the frame because this is the widest angle it goes, which I think is probably somewhere around 35 millimeters, 40 millimeters, something like that. But anyway, this is what you could expect from a vlogging scenario with this camcorder. I tested with stabilization on and off in every resolution just to be sure, and it never does anything at all. Not for photos and not for videos. This camera does not have image stabilization despite claiming to have it and even having the setting in the menu. It's simply a lie. The autofocus on this camera is the same, sometimes unreliable, pulsing autofocus that I've found on every Ordro I've tested that has autofocus. Autofocus will generally try once and then stop trying, even if it missed. It will only try again if you force it by zooming in or out, or if the scene changes enough, or if it just decides to get into a non-stop rhythm of pulsing. Once it tries again, maybe it'll hit, maybe not. Fortunately, it does have usable manual focus, but there are no focus aids like peaking or anything like that. And turning the focus knob adjusts the focus in steps, and it's a bit inconsistent and jumpy. If you combine that with the slightly mushy appearance this video always has, judging focus can be tricky. So, manual focus is slow, clunky, and difficult, but it does work. The only way to engage manual focus is to push the autofocus lock button on the front. Once focus is locked, you then manually adjust focus by turning this knob. If you zoom in or out at all, it immediately goes back to autofocus. So if you decide to reframe slightly, you may completely lose focus and have to start from scratch. It also has face tracking mode, but it's not reliable at detecting faces, and even when it doesn't seem to do anything but put boxes around them. It doesn't affect exposure or focus as far as I can tell, whether it's detecting a face or not. At one point, I was pointing the camera at me, and it finally put a box around my face, but it remained focused on the background and never changed the focus to my face. It's an utterly useless feature. There's also a feature in the settings called real-time focusing. I tried that on and off, and I couldn't tell any difference. So that feature does not seem to do anything either. It also claims to have optical time-of-flight ranging. In fact, that's one of the things shown on the little viewfinder display. It tells you whether the time-of-flight ranging is on or of. Whether this setting is on or of, it does nothing. It doesn't display or provide any additional information when it's on, and I found autofocus and manual focus behavior absolutely unchanged. Seriously, on or off, this setting doesn't do anything as far as I could tell. It's just another fake setting. There's also a wide dynamic range mode. It does boost the shadows a bit, but it doesn't make the highlights or shadows any less likely to clip, and it seems to introduce even more noise, so I never really found it useful. But hey, at least it does something. The white balance modes are classic Ordro. Auto is usually the best, though it still gives odd colors at times. The other modes are mostly unusable. For example, in daylight, the daylight mode just makes the greens a bit more neon. Cloudy or not, the cloudy mode is basically just a heavy yellow filter. There is a color temperature mode that lets you manually adjust the white balance temperature, which is probably the only mode worth using other than auto, though it does sometimes introduce a noticeable red color shift that you can't change. The image from this camera suffers from way too much sharpening and major smearing from noise reduction, while still showing a lot of noise. The ridiculous levels of sharpening causes edges to end up highlighted with thick white borders, which sometimes pulse in and out of existence as the focus pulses. Sharpening is pushed so far, it's absolutely reducing actual detail. The lens is also blurry toward the corners, especially at the wide end, where it also has moderate barrel distortion. And speaking of that 5K resolution and the sensor that's in this thing, here's a short clip of 1080p video from another camera. Now here are 3 different clips from the Ordro, each with a crop in to show detail. One of them is 5K, one is 4K, and one is 1080p. Can you tell which is which? 1080p out of this camera looks a bit more detailed than 720p out of this camera, but nothing above 1080p looks any different than 1080p. And as you saw, even the 1080p from this camera isn't exactly detailed for 1080p. Another thing that's classic Ordro is that it will only record until the file reaches 3.9 gigabytes, then it stops recording and starts again with a new file. It restarts pretty quickly, but in my testing I found it loses about a second, and for some reason the exposure sometimes changes between the clips too. It's definitely not seamless, even if you combine the clips in post. There are also at least 2 bad pixels or clusters of pixels on the sensor. Because of how mushy the image often is with all the noise reduction, and soft focus, they aren't always easy to see, but in the right conditions, there are 2 pretty glaring dots in the image from those bad pixels. Granted, anything can have a defect, but this isn't the first or even the second time I've had one of these generic cameras have bad pixels out of the box. It's at least the third. I tested this camera as a USB webcam, and the resolution seems fairly low. I'd guess 720p at the most, maybe a bit less. But the biggest problem is that it was really inconsistent for me. I started with a machine running Linux, and I couldn't get OBS to recognize this camera at all. I switched to a Windows machine, and it did work. I switched back to the Linux machine, and it worked briefly, but then stopped. I tried different cables and different ports on the machine, and it wouldn't come back. I switched back to the Windows machine, and then it wouldn't work there either. I got out a different camera, and it worked with every cable in every port on both computers without issue. I went back to the Ordro and tried it again later, and it was working again, so it technically works, but it was pretty unreliable for me. I'm now recording at my desk with the Ordro. I'm using the built-in microphone, and this is the audio and video you can get in this very well-lit scenario with the camera just 8 inches or so away from my mouth. As mentioned, the audio has an audio input jack, and it does work with passive mics, so it must be providing plug-in power, so that's good. It also does provide audio levels on the screen, and there are 3 different audio level options in the menu, so you can not only get some kind of an idea of the audio levels, but you can also adjust them. There's only 3 settings. There's high, middle, and low, but at least it is adjustable, so both of those things make this a little bit better of an audio experience than a lot of other Ordro cameras where it is what it is, you can't adjust it, there's no levels or anything like that. And it does seem like it records in stereo, or at least there are 2 tracks. Though I'm pretty sure there is only one built-in microphone because I don't detect any directionality at all to the sound. To test the quality of the audio input jack, I now have my booth audio running to the Ordro. Compared to how the booth sounded before, how does it sound when recorded by the Ordro? The setup is the same, with the same mic and the same preamp, but I'm now sending the output from my mixer into the Ordro instead of to my other camera or to a recorder. And while we have this set up, I'll go ahead and talk about the other accessories that come with the camera. There are actually 2 USB cables. I'm not sure why. This one is thicker than the other one, but both of them have only the pins for just USB 2. So I think that maybe this one's higher amperage, or I don't know. I don't know what the difference is, but it came with 2. It also came with a mini HDMI cable, or mini on one side and just a full-size HDMI on the other, so you could connect the camera to a monitor or TV or something. And it came with a little wireless remote control, which, interestingly, I've never actually tested. Does it work? Yeah, look at that. I can zoom. Oh, there you go. The remote works. Kind of a handy little addition. And it came with a memory card reader, just kind of a generic all-in-one reader. A lot of these types of cameras come with those kind of things. And you probably saw the autofocus pulse there a little bit. Autofocus? I don't know where that came from. But there you go. There is what the camera looks like in my booth and what it sounds like with high-quality audio being piped into the audio input jack. Honestly, as far as in a situation like this with controlled lighting, this Ordro probably does better than most in terms of accurate color and stuff like that. So it could be worse. In the end, regardless of this camera's performance, I can't recommend it. Don't get me wrong, the performance isn't great. It's probably worse than a similarly priced smartphone or action camera in most ways. Sure, this camera does have some zoom, but no image stabilization. The autofocus isn't very good, detail is bad, low light performance is bad, color is often weird, audio performance isn't great, it stops and restarts recording every time a file reaches 3.9 gigs, and it isn't seamless when you put it back together, and more. On the other hand, I get that cameras are getting more and more expensive, and this camera does record video and audio, so it's not like someone couldn't use it. But all that aside, I can't recommend a product where the manufacturer and the sellers blatantly lie so much. I've called these cameras out for false advertising for years. Ordro actually reached out to me years ago about my first few videos on their cameras. I pointed out all the incorrect things in their ads and the non-working features in their cameras, and they just made a bunch of excuses about how their cameras aren't for professionals and they don't have big money of a big camera company, and they demanded I take my videos down. I said that I would be happy to make corrections or take videos down if they could point out any accusations that were incorrect, and I said that if they make a camera that is advertised honestly, I would make a review of it and praise them for their changes. I never heard from them again. So, if you think this camera will fit your needs and you pick one up, I genuinely hope it works for you. But ultimately, I do not recommend it. Regardless of what else you can or can't get for this price, I still think the performance of this camera isn't very good for the price, and I'm just getting sick of all of the misrepresentations and outright lies in the ads. Hopefully that was helpful. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.